Hi, my name is Dennis Bourne. I want to welcome you to this presentation on human response to cultural trauma. So I'll start by introducing myself. Whenever I have to be introduced for something like this, the bio I submit always starts with something like Dennis Bourne was created and called by God to live out a passion for helping people of all ages who have experienced trauma and oppression to recognize and reach their potential in Christ. Along with that, I want you to know that I currently serve as Director of Behavioral Health at Lawndale Christian Health Center in Chicago, Illinois. My academic background includes undergraduate and graduate training in psychology and counseling at Kenyon College, Howard University, and Regent University. Professionally, I've worked in psychological research to improve the lives of military families and programming to improve psychology training for ethnic minorities and to decrease the stigma of mental illness in communities of color. As a therapist, I've worked with homeless men in recovery from addiction and drugs and alcohol, and at-risk youth in juvenile detention and residential treatment. I attend the New Community Covenant Church of Bronzeville, where I'm active in leadership, preaching, intercessory prayer, and worship ministry. I'm an advocate for racial righteousness, racial reconciliation, and justice. And I've led a number of anti-racism trainings and initiatives. So my topic for today, like I said, is going to be human response to cultural trauma. And by way of introduction to this topic, I want to start by outlining how three sociologists define this concept, which as sociological theories go is relatively young. So in his 2004 book, Cultural Trauma, Slavery and the Formation of African American Identity, Ron Eierman wrote, "Cultural trauma refers to the dramatic loss of identity and meaning, a tear in the social fabric affecting a group of people that has achieved some degree of cohesion. In this sense, the trauma need not necessarily be felt by everyone in the community or directly experienced by any or all. While it may be necessary to establish some event as the significant cause, its traumatic meaning must be established and accepted as a process which requires time, as well as mediation and representation." So Eierman goes on to describe cultural trauma as a reflective process that links the present to the past through representation and imagination. This leads to distorted identity formation due to overwhelming and repetitive experience of the world through trauma-prescribed roles such as victim or perpetrator. A colleague of Eierman's, Jeffrey Alexander, further defines the process of mediating and representing an experience, which is fundamental to the concept of cultural trauma. So in his 2014 book, Trauma: Social Theory, Alexander says, "Trauma is not the result of a group experience pain. It's the result of this acute discomfort entering the core of the collectivity's sense of its own identity. Collective actors decide to represent social pain as a fundamental threat to their sense of who they are, where they come from, and where they want to go." So in 2016, a third sociologist, Angela Onwuachi-Willig, wrote an article titled "The Trauma of the Routine: Lessons on Cultural Trauma from the Emmett Till Verdict." Her focus was on the collective experience of a continual pattern of abuse and subordination. This came in response to other definitions of cultural trauma that saw the inciting event as an interruption of what is considered normal or expected by the group or the broader society. Dr. Onwuachi-Willig wrote, "Specifically, I maintain that for certain subordinated groups and under certain circumstances, it is not the interruption of common routines that lays the foundation for cultural trauma, but rather the continuation of what is considered to be a given or expected subordination, usually through law or government sanction, that creates the context in which a cultural trauma can be narrated. That said, the fact that a cultural trauma stems from a routine occurrence does not mean that a shock to some norm was completely absent from the construction of this trauma. Indeed, in cases where a routine occurrence develops into cultural trauma, a shocking or unique incident has usually preceded the routine injury, Frequently, these prior shocking incidents have helped generate one of the conditions that I contend enable cultural trauma to emerge out of a routine harm: widespread publicity, whether regional, national, or international, that causes individuals to focus on or pay attention to the actual occurrence of routine harm. So Onwuachi Willig also spoke further of the mediation and representation process I mentioned earlier. She describes it as having three requirements. First, a longstanding history of routine harm that leads the group to expect nothing other than routine and cultural trauma inducing injury. Second, there has to be media attention to the routine harm, leading to widespread awareness of people inside and outside the subordinated group. And third, public discourse about the meaning of routine harm in the form of government or legal affirmation of the group's marginalized status. So according to Onwuachi Willig, this public or official sanctioning reignites the subordinated group's consciousness of its second-class citizenship and punctuates its already existing distress and suffering, thereby causing such tension and pain to boil over and lay the foundation for the development of a cultural trauma narrative. So that is just a very quick overview of some of the concepts involved in cultural trauma. And now to help us understand the collective and individual impact of cultural trauma, I want to explore the experience of the people of Israel in the book of Exodus. First, I'll talk about how the enslavement of the Israelites represents a cultural trauma. Then I'll talk more specifically about how Moses and the people around him serve as examples of responses to cultural trauma. So the book of Exodus opens with the people of Israel living at peace and as guests, welcome guests in Egypt, until a new king feels threatened by the size of their population and the growth and thriving of their population. So this king orders them to be enslaved and systematically abused as a way to control the population. When the Israelites continue to thrive even in slavery, the king ups the ante to an attempted genocide by ordering all male children to be murdered at birth. So this opposition continues across several decades and multiple political administrations. It finally ends when God himself answers the prayers of the Israelites and miraculously welcomes them from Egypt under the leadership of Moses. So Moses leads them out of Egypt and into the wilderness, where they wander for 40 years before reaching their promised and prophesied homeland. So the slavery of the Israelites definitely qualifies as what Onwuachi Willig described as a pattern of abuse and subordination leading to cultural trauma. Exodus documents the long-standing history of routine harm. There was widespread, if not universal, awareness of this harm within both the Israelite people and the Egyptian citizenry. The communication was achieved through the contemporary equivalent of the media, which was word of mouth and regal decrees. The harm was not only sanctioned, but ordered by the highest level of government officials. And both Israelites and Egyptians were deputized by the government to be complicit in implementing the oppression and the genocide. So the Bible makes it clear that the Israelites were painfully aware of their second-class citizenship and fully expected to suffer, even as they prayed and hoped for God's deliverance. So fast forwarding past the rescue to the Israelites' time in the wilderness, you can see what Eierman and Alexander called the mediation and representation of the trauma of slavery. In the book of Exodus, you see clear depictions of the impact of the oppression on their identities and their imaginations. Immediately after leaving Egypt and throughout their 40-year journey, there's a discussion of the experience of slavery. There are songs, oral written histories, maxims, prayers. The book of Exodus as a religious text was written by Moses decades later and focused very clearly and intimately on their experience of slavery and how it affected them. And many of the subsequent books of the Old and New Testament reference slavery in Egypt as a part of the collective history, not just of the Israelites, but of Christians as well. And the story of enslavement is depicted as a part of the triumphal and inspiring story of God's rescue, but also as the source of the enslaved mindset that creates separation from God, even for those who were born generations later, decades, millennia later. To this day, Jewish culture includes annual holidays that serve as ceremonial reminders of this period of slavery. So, moving past this idea of the Israelite slavery as an example of cultural trauma, I want to talk about how we can use the book of Exodus to explore examples of how people respond to experiences of cultural trauma. Three of the most potent examples or potent results of trauma include including cultural trauma. And these results include the theft of a person's voice, the theft of their agency, and the theft of their empathy. Moses and his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam each represent a different loss and how it plays out in life, even a spiritual and historically exceptional life. So we'll start with Moses. Moses had a unique experience and role in this story, both during and after the period of slavery. He was raised as the adopted son of an Egyptian princess. So he heard about and witnessed the oppression, but wouldn't have experienced it directly. He still felt a connection to his people and a sense of righteous indignation in response to the injustice they experienced. Moses murdered an Egyptian for treating an Israelite man too harshly, then became an exile. He was later used by God to help liberate the people from oppression, then led the people in the wilderness after they were rescued. So Moses was faithful to God to the point of being an absentee husband and father. He was a workaholic and took on more than he probably should have. He believed wholeheartedly in God and God's promises, and he wanted everyone to believe as firmly as he believed. And he got pissed off when they didn't. Moses listened to wise counsel, whether it came from God or the people around them. But just as Moses clearly demonstrated the strengths and resilience that are born out of cultural trauma, he also exemplified the loss of voice. When Moses was initially called by God to rescue the people of Israel, and several later times when given instructions by God, Moses immediately replied that he was not a public speaker. This led to his insecurity about his ability to lead, to advocate, and to represent God and his people. The other natural consequence of having your voice stolen is not being able to express your emotions and your needs. People who are oppressed frequently are denied the training and opportunities to safely and effectively express the frequently negative and often overwhelming emotions that go along with a lifestyle of subordination. As a result, all of their emotions are channeled into anger, as they were with Moses, which seems to restore a sense of power and control over your immediate environment. That's why the expression of anger feels so appropriate and safe for people who have experienced this kind of trauma. So as was the case in Moses, you end up with a 100-year-old man throwing temper tantrums. You see several instances of significant outbursts of this anger, leading to significant consequences for Moses and the people of Israel. There's the murder that led to his exile. There's the throwing down of the tablets that the Ten Commandments were written on. And there's the striking the rock against God command, which led to his not getting into the promised land. So I have a number of patients, mainly men of color, who exhibit similar behavior and emotions. These symptoms often stem from feelings of powerlessness and the inability to protect yourself and your loved ones from harm. When you're faced with systemic injustice, there's a sense that you're always mad and you don't know why, because you don't have a single visible target at whom to direct your anger. So that's Moses. And you have Aaron, who was offered as God's solution to Moses' trouble speaking, because Aaron was effective at expressing himself. More accurately, Aaron was effective at expressing other people's feelings, needs, and will. He was the second prophet in the family. He stood with Moses before the people, and in at least one instance before God. For the most part, when Aaron was delegated or assigned a role, he was faithful to that role. But Aaron was happiest being the man next to the man, to execute others' desires, even when God invited him to be more. Aaron and his sons became the first in the new order of priesthood. After the law was handed down to Moses, he helped carry out the required sacrifices and led the people in observing rituals. But where Moses was dogmatic and steadfast, Aaron equivocated and was easily influenced, where Moses lacked a voice. Aaron lacked agency. In Egypt, he got pulled into speaking for Moses, as I mentioned. In the wilderness, he was with Moses when Moses was around and assertive. But then Aaron was with the people when their voices were louder than Moses's or louder than God's. When Moses took longer than expected on Mount Sinai, talking to God about the laws, Aaron obeyed the people and made them an idol. And then he lied to Moses about where the idol came from. Aaron also joined his sister in questioning Moses' leadership. This indecision that Aaron displayed led the people astray and away from God's promises. Aaron exemplifies the idea of being created as a worshiper and wholeheartedly worshiping God or whatever thing is placed in front of him because of his lack of agency. This agency that's stolen by cultural trauma. This lack of agency serves as an effective and protective response during oppression. It's something I also see in many patients who've been exposed to trauma. It's protective in the sense that it makes compliance with the demands of the oppressor feel more natural, more comfortable. It also reduces the likelihood that you'd be the target of the full anger of the oppressor because you're compliant and placating. Likewise, oppression feels less burdensome because you don't have a will or desires for this oppression to steal from you. So that's Aaron. So then you have Miriam, who's Moses' sister. She's the third sibling and the third prophet in the family. She was, in fact, the first woman in the Bible who was described as a prophet, and in that sense, she was a trailblazer. She was the strategist and the brains of the family, for better and for worse. The first time you see her in Exodus, she convinces Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted Moses, to hire Moses' birth mother as his nursemaid. Then she appears next in Exodus 15, just after the crossing of the Red Sea. And at this point, she's leading the women in a song to celebrate God's victory. Among the leadership and the people, Miriam serves as the memory and celebrant of the impact of the past on the present. But again, where Moses lacked a voice and Aaron lacked Aaron lacked agency, Miriam lacks empathy. And it comes up more clearly in her final appearance in the Exodus story, which is actually recounted in Numbers 12. Miriam, along with Aaron, is opposing Moses' marriage to an African woman. And then after opposing this marriage to the African woman, they go on to question Moses' claim to leadership, given that God had spoken to all three of them and through all three of them to the people. So it's theorized that Miriam was the ringleader for this opposition, again, back to her role as a strategist and back to Aaron's role of lacking agency. And this is why she ends up being punished more harshly by God. And when she opposes Moses' God-given leadership, she's struck with a temporary leprosy. And at that point, Aaron just receives a lecture from God. So it's very common for people who experience cultural trauma to experience a similar lack of empathy. It's a natural response, kind of like Aaron's and Moses's, kind of like the body's response to pain. For example, I recently cut my thumb. The whole time my thumb was hurting and healing, the pain made it seem like my thumb was the most important part of my body and somehow involved in every action I took. It was the squeaky wheel and it kept demanding all the oil, so to speak. When you're experiencing or recovering from chronic trauma, all of you, becomes the part that's hurting. So your bandwidth to see or appreciate the pain and the needs of others is taken away. Systematic oppression like racism in the United States intentionally perpetuates the lie that all of life is a zero-sum game, and any gain for someone else comes at the expense of your loss. So for Miriam, this plays out in the sense that Moses' Ethiopian bride was an outsider and a potential threat. And God's elevation of Moses meant she would necessarily lose some of her influence and authority. This lack of empathy kept Miriam from being able to appreciate the value of her role and celebrate with Moses. Instead, she gives into jealousy and ingratitude. And just as many of my patients suffering with cultural trauma struggle in relationships with family, partners, friends, and coworkers because they have a hard time expressing empathy for others' feelings and needs. They see others, even their children, as a competition for resources. And they're not able to support others in their experience of trauma. So those are 3 examples of individual responses to cultural trauma. But I also want to talk about the rest of the Israelites as an example of collective response to cultural trauma. So the rest of the Israelites are a group of individuals, but are described in Exodus almost like a monolithic mass. They mostly complain. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they're afraid, they're bored. The Israelites as a group have seen all of the miracles that all the other characters have seen, but the overwhelming evidence of God's grace and faithfulness is not enough to change their complaining, their natural response to having endured trauma. As a group, they seem to embody the idea of inertia, or Newton's first law of motion. They stay at rest or in motion until acted on by an external force. And that force is usually discomfort or difficulty. So they're fine until they face discomfort. Then they become demanding. They demand water. They demand food. They demand a golden calf. They demand not to fight. They demand to be freed from slavery until emancipation becomes a difficult process, and then they demand to stay in slavery. Then they're freed, and when freedom becomes difficult, they demand to return to slavery. And when following God in their freedom becomes difficult, they rush into sin and idolatry until they face the difficulty of God's punishment, and then they wholeheartedly recommit to God. There's a very real sense in which the group's tendencies represent a synthesis of the lacks of voice, agency, and empathy that we saw in Aaron and Miriam and Moses. For this reason, they tend to prefer the devil they know, even if that devil represents actual suffering. Faced with the lack of identity that comes with cultural trauma, the group defaults to identifying with the identity of the oppressor or the identity the oppressor has assigned to them. Alexia Rothman, in her presentation on internal family systems, talked about the tendency of patients after recovery to miss or cling to their diagnoses because their diagnoses provide an identity, and they provide a shorthand to explain the patient's experience to others. Because it's difficult for others to understand your sadness, your lack of energy, your fatigue, your lack of interest, your irritability. But people understand depression. People understand what bipolar means to an extent. People understand schizophrenia. So it is a shorthand in a sense. People understand trauma and hurt. And so sometimes it's hard to let these things go as an identity and as an explanation for why you do what you do, or think how you think, or feel how you feel. And similarly, the Israelites cling and default to their familiar identity as slaves throughout their time in the wilderness. So there are many correlates to the experience of the Israelites and their story in Exodus, and the cultural trauma narratives that you see in other people groups, whether that's Black people or Asian people, Hispanic Latino people, the many native tribes of Hawaii and Australia, the Native American tribes of our own country and our own continent. And as the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. Or put another way, God is infinitely creative in how he makes us. But the devil is infinitely less creative in how he breaks us. But that doesn't make us any less broken and any less in need of healing and salvation. So my goal during this time was to describe how we become broken collectively, how cultural trauma occurs and how it manifests in people individually and as a group. As usual, the Bible is a useful tool in examining human behavior and human stories. It's also useful in helping us recognize God's intervention in these stories. A necessary part of healing cultural trauma is following God's lead and the lead of his people, just as cultural trauma is defined in the retelling of stories. It can be helped by reframing those stories, those trauma narratives, and recognizing where God is present and at work in those narratives. When we use our voice, when we use our reclaimed voices to tell our stories and to call others to account for the roles they played in those stories, when we use our reclaimed agency to make a future that looks different than the past, to make different decisions, and when we use our reclaimed empathy to have compassion for those experiencing and recovering from their own trauma, then, and only then, can we begin the process of healing. Thank you very much.